Have you ever been busy? You finally sat down to rest and you feel guilty about it, about everything you should be doing? Sometimes the problem is more than just a crowded calendar. Sometimes beneath the exhaustion can be what would you say, a quiet fear that too much depends on us. And in this episode, we're going to trace the biblical story of rest from creation to the Sabbath to the invitation Jesus gives where he says, "Come to me and I will give you rest." And we'll discover why rest is not laziness or a reward for finishing everything, but it is a practical trust, and how both quiet rest and active rest can help us form a life that is more dependent on the Lord. And today, my goal for our time together is that you'll leave with answers to three important questions. One, why is rest so difficult for some of us? Two, what lies behind that difficulty? And three, how can we begin to overcome that difficulty in a simple, practical, doable way? And I'll be upfront. Some of you are going to love this, and some of you are going to hate it. I used to do some occasional kayak fishing, offshore saltwater stuff. It was a lot of fun. And I used to belong to a Facebook group of guys who did that as well. And one day I remember a message popped up that a guy was planning a trip up to Fraser Island. And he said there's 15 spots available or something like that. And that's something I always wanted to do, but I was hesitant about going. And I talked to my wife about it. And she said, "Oh, you should go." And so I put my hand up and gave him my name. And I was still apprehensive about it, though, because I didn't want to leave the church. And to be fair, things were different at the time. But I was concerned about leaving the church for an entire week. And I thought, well, maybe I should just cancel and stay home. And I went back and forth on it. And I was talking to my wife about it and told her, I don't know if I really want to go. And I'm concerned about what will happen while I'm gone. And I kept dragging my feet. And she finally said to me, she said, "You're not nearly as important as you think you are." So I went on the fishing trip. And long story short, it was one of the best trips I've ever been on. It was an incredible fishing trip. We cleaned up, caught a lot of big fish. But do you know what happened while I was away? Absolutely nothing. And while I was on the trip, one of the guys asked me what he did. And I said, "I'm a pastor." And he said, "Oh, okay. What do you do during the week?" And I thought he was just joking, but he was serious as a heart attack. And one of the things I found about being a pastor is that most people don't see most of what I do. But I suppose that's really true for all of us. When you think of your friends, family, and people around you, maybe even people you work with, most of the time we just don't see what they do when we're not around. But we do often understand that people are busy. And one of the observations I've made over the years is that we can be concerned about people who we see who look like they're overdoing it, maybe doing too much. And we might even encourage them to take a break, but we generally don't focus that back on ourselves. And I think that for most of us, a crowded calendar makes us feel important, and availability makes us feel valuable. And the reality is there's always another email to answer, another job to do, another task to complete, someone else that needs to be talked to, another problem to solve, another opportunity to take advantage of. And technology plays a part in that also. I've talked about it before. I like technology. I love to use it. It's a great servant, but it's a terrible master. And it's intended to save us time, but if we don't discipline ourselves with it and form the right habits, it wastes our time, and it also makes us permanently busy and permanently available. We can leave our workplace and take work home with us. Technology is great for that. A lot of people work from home now, and it's hard to differentiate between work and home. But our mind is always dwelling on things we want to do, things we need to do, things we need to get done. Have you ever been sitting still? Maybe you're on the lounge in the evening or whatever, and something comes to mind that you need to finish. Maybe it's something you want to do. And You decide that going and doing that thing is easier than just sitting there, or it's more comfortable than just sitting there. And rest for a lot of people has become uncomfortable. It's hard to just be still and rest. And we often feel like we're wasting time when we do. I don't know, maybe that's because we feel guilty, but we're often thinking about what's going on somewhere else, what we should be doing. And we know we should rest, but it almost feels like we're wasting time. We feel guilty about it. So what we do then is we turn it into an achievement. We track it, we optimize it, we schedule it, and then we look back and judge whether or not we did it right. Even in rest, we're good at creating busyness. Maybe the problem isn't that we have too much to do or not enough time to do it. Maybe the real problem is that we worry because we believe that too much depends on us, or we worry that we're wasting time. And we're afraid to say no to people because we feel they won't value us if we do. And every time we say yes to one thing, we say no to another. And we think if I stop, something bad's going to happen. The wheels are going to fall off. Who's going to keep everything going if I don't do it? If I say no, it's going to disappoint someone. If I'm not producing something or saying yes, I feel like I don't have value. We might even view rest as weakness or a waste of time or laziness. And if anything like that is a struggle for you, as it is for me, I think our first realization needs to be that that thought and that behavior has been formed in us by an ordinary habit over time. We've made it a habit of feeling like that and doing that. And I think it's also helpful to realize that our struggle with being uncomfortable with rest, or the guilt we might feel when we do rest, and the fear of saying no, is often connected to our identity. It's connected to a need for control. It's connected to our personal value, which ultimately is connected with our understanding of God and rest. And it all comes down to a quiet belief that we may not even realize, but we think we're more important than we really are. Stopping is not laziness. That's an entirely different topic. We're not talking about laziness. We're talking about rest. In Scripture, God actually commands rest, and Jesus invites us to rest. And I have to confess, to be upfront, that up until this past week, I hadn't taken a day off for months. And I figured, well, if I'm going to talk about rest, I better take a day of rest before I do this. There's always something else to be done. It just never ends. One more person who needs something. And of course, I can make excuses about it. I need to stay busy because God has called me to be a pastor. This is what I do. It's what I'm supposed to do. I love the church. I love people. I want to help people. So it's okay for me to stay busy. And if I'm transparent about it, when I say that, there's a little part of me in the back of my mind that takes pride in my busyness. And behind that, my sin nature is telling me, you are so important. How could anything possibly get done without you? When we think about rest, we likely think about it as recovery from work or stress management. And in a sense, it is those things. It's a recharge. And those are reasonable things. But the Bible doesn't introduce rest as a human invention for managing stress. If you look back to the creation narrative in the book of Genesis, it tells us that God rested on the seventh day from all the work he had done. And God didn't rest because he was tired. He doesn't need to rest. He rested because his work was complete, and he took time to enjoy what he'd made. Work and being busy are good things, but they were never intended to be endless the way we tend to treat them. And in his creation, when you read the book of Genesis, you see that when God created things, he put limits and boundaries on things. And you see that all through Scripture. The sea and the land, the day and the night, measures of time. From the very beginning, God established limits and boundaries. And in the creation narrative, on the sixth day, God created people. And on the seventh day, God rested. And have you ever considered that humanity's first full day of existence was a day of rest? Humans didn't begin their existence by proving their value, earning their place, answering calls or emails, or completing a to-do list. The first full day of human existence was spent enjoying what God had already provided, resting in God's provision. Adam and Eve's first full day was the seventh day. God's first, that was God's seventh day, and it was Adam and Eve's first day. God worked and then rested. People enjoyed and rested in what God had provided. And then they worked. And that matters. That matters. You know, if you're old enough, you might remember when everything was closed on Sunday, because Sunday was considered a day of rest. And that's not a bad thing at all. But what we're talking about today is more than just a day of the week, or a day on a calendar. We're talking about a principle of creation that was in place even before the fall. Even before the Ten Commandments and Levitical laws, humanity received rest before labor. An important thing to realize from that is that we work from God's provision, not towards it. That's a principle. We don't work to earn provision. We work from provision. We don't work to earn identity. We work from the identity of belonging to God. We don't work towards value with God. And I like to think of it like this. My grandson, he turned 1 year old back in May. And I remember when he was born. When he was born, I went to the hospital, and I didn't give him a to-do list or tell him to go get a job and prove his value, and then I would love him and care for him. I loved him before he did anything. And we work and we grow from God's provision, not towards it. And the same pattern later became a command for Israel. In Exodus chapter 20, we read about that. God gives a commandment. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. He says 6 days you'll labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. And then God takes that back to the creation narrative again. He says, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and rested on the seventh. The Old Testament practice of Sabbath keeping was about more than recharging and maintaining a healthy life-work balance like we often think of it. It was a weekly act of worship. In keeping the Sabbath, Israel declared that the God who created the world is still sustaining it, and he provides for his people. And at the time, this would have had very special meaning for the Israelite people, because when they received that command, they were only out of Egypt about 7 weeks, and they'd been delivered from 400 years of slavery. And that's when they received the Ten Commandments. And when they were slaves under Pharaoh, their identity was a slave. It was slavery. And their worth was measured by production. And they had no illusion of self-reliance. That wasn't a problem for them at the time. And Pharaoh treated them as units of labor whose value depended on what they produced. And it was Pharaoh who gave them provision. And they worked for it. That's just the way it was. Now, when God rescues them from slavery, he commanded them to stop working 1 day out of 7 and rest. And there were several reasons for that. One was to cease from ordinary labor, but it was also to remind them that God is the creator and he's also their provider. And they were to view rest as a gift, unlike a slave who would receive it as a reward. They were no longer slaves who belonged to Pharaoh. They were now God's people. They weren't machines. They weren't commodities or slaves. They were God's people. And part of rest is remembering that. Another important aspect to that is that they were also supposed to extend that rest to their family, their servants, foreigners, even animals. That meant that all work ceased. There was no work happening at all on the Sabbath. No one could take the day off and maybe put a servant to work plowing the field with the animals just to, keep things going. And that matters because it required trusting God to sustain life while work ceased completely. They couldn't remain partially self-reliant by maybe saying, okay, well, I'm taking the day off and I'm resting, but putting someone else to work. And even before the Ten Commandments, God gave the same principle when the Israelites were in the wilderness, and he provided them with manna on their way to Mount Sinai. When they left Egypt and went into the wilderness, God provided them with food, the manna. And they were to gather it each day, and they were only to gather enough for that day. And if they gathered more than a day's worth, it would rot and it wouldn't be any good. But on the sixth day, God provided twice as much so they could have enough for the seventh day. And that wasn't about a work-life balance or managing stress. They didn't have jobs per se at the time that sustained them like we do. They still had to care for family and animals and things like that, but they didn't have employment per se. And God used that to begin to form a habit. That cessation from work and busyness was the practice, and trust was the habit that the practice formed. They had to trust God to provide enough to sustain them. They had to trust him each day to do that. And they had to learn to do it. It took some time because some went out and they tried to collect extra and then it would rot, or they went out on the seventh day and there wasn't anything for them to gather. So it was something they had to learn. And now here comes the uncomfortable application. Rest and the lack thereof exposes what we trust. If I find my identity in performance, when I stop performing, that puts pressure on my identity and my identity feels threatened. Or if my security is found in control, rest puts pressure on my control, and that affects my security and how I feel. And rest feels lazy or irresponsible. If my value comes from being needed, saying no puts pressure on my value, and it feels like failure when I say no. When we don't rest, we become exhausted, and exhaustion intensifies the longer we go. Exhaustion then puts pressure on my ability to perform, and that often leads to anxiety. If you've ever been that tired where you feel anxious. And as we've talked about before, pressure reveals what formation has been building. And if we feel that anxiety, it exposes the habit that has been forming. We don't feel anxious because we're exhausted in that scenario. We're anxious because our ordinary habits have formed a rule of life that has put us on a path of self-reliance. And we're anxious because we're worried we won't be able to sustain ourselves. We're worried everything won't get done. We're worried things will fall apart if we don't keep control of them. Rest teaches us to trust God. And humans can take just about anything and turn it into a religious performance or a ritual. And by the time of Jesus in the New Testament, that's exactly what had happened. People had turned God's command to keep the Sabbath into another form of religious performance. And a command that God had given them as a gift to protect rest had become a burden for people to carry. And Jesus confronts that in Mark chapter 2, verse 27, where he says the Sabbath was made for man, not the man for Sabbath. And people often misunderstand the concept of biblical obedience. They think it's about control or maybe a means of acceptance by God. If I'm good enough and I do enough, God will accept me, or, God wants to control me, or church wants to control me, or whatever. But it's neither of those. A trusting faith in Jesus is the only means of acceptance by God. And obedience, it's following biblical commands, it's similar to being lost in the wilderness. And someone comes up and they hand you a GPS. And they say, follow this, and it will show you the best way to get to where you want to go. And if someone did that, handed us a GPS in a situation like that, we probably wouldn't say, oh, you're just trying to control me, or don't tell me what to do. The moral commands of Scripture put us on the best path to navigate what is often a difficult life. Rest is a gift God has given us. It's not a grading system of spirituality. It's meant to remind us that we don't have to prove ourselves to be accepted and to have value. God already has placed value on us. And if we know Christ, we're already accepted. And in Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30, Jesus says, come to me, all you who labor and are heavy burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. He says, for I'm meek and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. And he also says, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And Jesus is obviously saying a lot more there than take a day off. He says, come to me. Genuine rest is more than an empty day on a calendar or a nap. All those are great. Don't get me wrong. Genuine rest is based on coming to Jesus, which requires trusting Jesus. And he also says, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. Now, if you don't know, a yoke is an instrument of work. It's like a wooden cross piece that was put between a couple of animals so they could pull a cart or a plow. A yoke is an instrument of work and submission. So Jesus isn't calling us to a life without care or without work or without responsibility. He says, what he's doing is he said, hey, come to me and trade in the yoke of performance, self-sufficiency, sin, and the expectations of others, and put mine on instead. Learn my way of living. Now, that still involves service. It still involves obedience. It involves sacrifice. But Jesus carries it with you. And his acceptance is not based on our performance, but on God's grace. And Jesus not only offers rest, he also teaches us how to care for others, take on work and responsibility without becoming a slave to those things, like the Israelites were in Egypt. Hebrews chapter 4, verses 9 and 10 say, there remains therefore a rest for the people of God. For he who enters his rest will also cease from his own works, as God did from his. And then verse 11 goes on to say, let us labor therefore to enter that rest, lest anyone fall by the same pattern of unbelief. Working to enter rest sounds a bit contradictory initially. But during their time in the wilderness, when the Israelites faced fear, they often failed to trust God. And that culminated when they came to the border of the promised land. And they refused to enter into the land because they were afraid. They refused to enter into the land God had promised them because they were afraid of who already lived there. So they forfeited entering into what God had promised them because their fear outweighed their trust. And verse 11 warns us not to fall into that same pattern of unbelief. And it's a pattern because it was repeated. It was repeated unbelief. It was a repeated lack of trust. And over time, that became a habit, formed a rule of life that placed them on the path. And the destination of that path was forfeiting what God had promised. And because of that, an entire generation died in the wilderness. And it wasn't a single moment of fear or lack of trust that led to that. It was a repeated habit. It was something repeated over time that formed a habit. And Hebrews is telling us, don't form a habit of unbelief or don't form a habit of not trusting God. But when it comes to rest, how many of us have formed that habit, a habit of self-reliance rather than trusting God? We think everything depends on us. The biblical principle of rest points us towards the gospel. We can't work hard enough or stay busy enough to remove our sin or make ourselves acceptable to God. It's not about self-reliance. Jesus completed the work of redemption when he suffered and died on the cross and through his resurrection. And on the cross, he said, it's finished. And like the creation narrative, God had already done the work, and Adam and Eve rested in what God had provided. The gospel is the same way. The work is already done. We rest in what's been provided. And trusting Jesus means resting the full weight of our redemption on his finished work and ceasing to attempt to secure what only God can provide. So rest, it's not just inactivity. It is ceasing from self-reliance and trusting God's provision. And Hebrews says, let us labor, therefore, to enter that rest, lest anyone fall by the same pattern of unbelief. So we're being warned there not to form a habit of self-reliance and a lack of trust, and whether it be physically or spiritually. Rest helps us form a habit of trusting God. Rest teaches us that God remains faithful when we stop fretting, when we stop worrying, and when we stop trying to be self-reliant. And we often think everything relies on me. If I don't do this, everything's going to fall apart. And we think, I don't have time to rest. And that's easy to do in the moment. But when we repeat that over time, we begin to form a habit of doing that. And the ordinary habit of rest, and it challenges self-reliant fear that says everything depends on me. It exposes that to us. Have you ever said, it's hard to rest, or I don't have time to rest? That's why we do what our verse says and labor to resist that, resist self-reliance, and surrender control and trust that the world is in God's hands. It's not in ours. It's not just about leaving a day open on a calendar. It's about believing that God is God and I'm not. I'm not as important as I think I am. Rest teaches us to trust. It teaches us to trust God, and that echoes into everything else. It spills over into other things, kind of like a pebble in a pond. It reinforces other things. It's not a reward for work or faithfulness. Rest is actually an expression of faith. When we cease striving, we declare that God's our creator and he's our provider, and we're dependent on him. And we can rest in that, realizing that we rest in his provision. And have you ever wondered, or have you ever thought, I wonder if I've done enough to be accepted by God? And you don't have to wonder about that. The answer is a resounding no, you haven't. None of us have. There's only one person who has ever done that, and that's Jesus. But the good news is he's done what we can't. He's done it for us. Like God created the universe and Adam and Eve rested in his provision, Jesus has already done everything that needs to be done, and we turn to him in faith, knowing that we can't be self-reliant and we can't earn God's grace, but we don't have to because of what Jesus has already done for us on the cross. Well, we began with 3 questions. Why is rest difficult for us? What lies behind the difficulty? And then how can we begin to overcome that difficulty? Well, rest is difficult because stopping requires us to relinquish control and trust God. And what lies behind that difficulty is often our tendency to try to carry the weight of the entire world, because we mistakenly believe that everything depends on us and everything's going to fall apart without us. And this is how we can begin to overcome that in a formative way, overcome that fear of what's going to happen if I don't do this. As we do every week, grow, live, go, grow. Build a daily stopping practice. Something simple, doesn't have to be dramatic, but just take 5 minutes a day, pick a time, and read Matthew 11, verses 28 through 30. Then name one task that you didn't get done that day. And maybe you could name a worry, a responsibility, something like that, maybe a task. And pray, Jesus, I'm going to give you what's not finished, and I'm going to trust you with it. Teach me to trust your care while I rest. Teach me to trust your provision while I rest. And then deliberately leave that task until the next day. Just let it go until the next day. And that small habit trains us away from self-reliance and towards confidence in God's provision. And then live. Protect one realistic block of 60 to 90 minutes this week where you stop ordinary work, you refuse to be productive. Choose rest that authentically restores you. You don't have to just sit and do nothing to rest. Maybe there's all kinds of things you can do. Some that might mean sitting still and being quiet. It might mean sleeping, reading. It might mean a meal with a friend or a family member. For others, it could be anything. Walking, fishing, gardening, creating, being creative. That's one that I enjoy. Or maybe spending time outdoors. And put your phone on Do Not Disturb. And before you begin, name what you fear might fall apart while you stop. And then pray, God, you're God, and I'm not, and I trust you with this. And then when guilt and the tyranny of the urgent starts to creep in, resist the impulse to get up and fix everything, to go back to being busy again. 60 to 90 minutes. Start there and work up from there. And receive rest, the gift of rest, as an expression of trust in God. And then go. Give someone else a gift of rest. Think of one person who is carrying too much. They've got a huge burden and they're very busy and they're overrun with tasks. And remove one concrete burden from them this week. Maybe prepare a meal, watch their kids for them, cover a task, make a difficult phone call maybe, or simply give them your unhurried company. Just hang out with them for a while. And, ask yourself, what would give someone some genuine breathing room? What would be truly helpful for someone if I were to remove that task? And don't just tell them to rest. We always do that, but help make rest possible for them. And extending rest reminds them that their value is greater than their output. We care about people for who they are, not just what they do. If this podcast has encouraged you in some way, if you found it helpful, share it with someone who's carrying too much. Share it with someone who's struggling, exhausted, anxious, trying to keep everything under control, feeling like everything's going to fall apart if I'm not busy all the time. And also, please follow the podcast as we continue learning the ordinary habits that God uses to form extraordinary faith. And remember, rest is not a reward for faithfulness. It's an expression of faith. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to Walking with Conviction in an Anxious Age. As you go, remember, following Jesus isn't about having all the answers, but walking faithfully with the truth you've been given. Stay present, think clearly, walk intentionally. And wherever Jesus leads you this week, keep walking. Faithful, grounded, and free.